there's probably no sport in the world that's changed as rapidly as MMA.
What new sport can you think of other than MMA from 1993 that's now a huge global force?
And the biggest thing that has changed is the fighters and their style. Over time, different fighting styles have been viewed as the most effective, only for a new generation to come along and tear up the blueprint. Whether it's wrestling, kickboxing, cardio machines, or all-rounders, these so-called metas of MMA have revolutionized the sport overnight and then disappeared just as quickly. So this is the ideal MMA fighting style throughout history. When the UFC was first founded in 1993, no one knew what fighting style would reign supreme. But the second UFC 1 got underway, one stood out from the others: Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
How do you show the effectiveness of jiu-jitsu? Well, here's what you do. You lock some dudes in a cage with no rules, guy's bigger than him, and he's wearing his gi, so he's the only one that looks like what we think of as a martial artist, right? And you get these guys.
Everyone else looks like big old street thugs.
They're jacked up on steroids, they're giant, and they're running after him.
Despite being undersized, Royce Gracie dominated the early UFC events, which were usually one-night tournaments with only one single winner. It didn't matter if he fought a kickboxer, wrestler, judoka, or anything else, BJJ was clear of its competition.
And then I saw Royce walk around and he had his gi on. And I always thought that was funny when somebody walked around with their gi. You're like, brother, come on, man, really? And I felt bad for him because he looked young and he was small. And I was like, this guy's gonna get hurt. Like, what are they doing?
One of the main reasons why was because very few people had even seen this grappling martial art before. Everyone who fought understood a takedown, a kick to the liver, or an overhand to the chin, but triangle chokes and sneaky submissions were different. You either knew about it, or you were a victim.
I remember going and shooting on him, and I'd go to take him down, and he just like spins, and like there was no resistance whatsoever. Where I was struggling or any of that, it was so smooth and easy, and but yet I'm like in bad position. I'm like, how did this happen? And then all of a sudden I feel this thing around my neck, and I'm like, okay, I'll just, because I'm a strong guy, I'll just pull it off. Well, there's nothing to pull off. There's nothing there that I can grab to pull off. And the next thing I know, I'm tapping and I'm looking up and I'm going, I just tapped.
So for a couple of years, the UFC belonged to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But in 1995, there was a major change. Ken Shamrock, a wrestler, survived 36 straight minutes with Royce Gracie back in the days where some fights wouldn't have rounds or time limits. It showed that if you understood BJJ to a good enough level and could survive, you could nullify it. After that fight, Royce left the UFC, opening a chasm for a new style of fighting to take center stage, and now it was the wrestler's turn.
I was a wrestler too. I had a pretty strong background. Not like a lot of these guys like Randy and some of these other guys that, like even Dan Severn, man, there's some credentials there. Those guys were really, really qualified wrestlers and came in like Don Fry. I mean, those guys were beasts in the wrestling world.
All of a sudden, guys like Mark Coleman, Dan Severn, Mark Kerr were running through the opposition. It didn't matter how good their opponent's skills were. If they couldn't defend the takedowns and get back to their feet, the fight was as good as over before it had even begun.
Yeah, I think it's the foundation, because the wrestler can dictate where the fight takes place. You know, if the wrestler chooses to stand, he can stand. If the wrestler wants to get back up, he can get back up.
Right.
And the wrestler knows how to take the guy down.
Of course, there were exceptions to the rule, but mostly those UFC tournament winners and early champions were big, powerful American wrestlers with strong NCAA backgrounds. In 1997, though, we saw the first chink in the armor of the wrestlers. Kickboxer Maurice Smith was able to defend the then heavyweight champion Mark Coleman's takedowns, out-cardio him, and show the world that wrestling wasn't the only way to succeed in the UFC. So when more rounded fighters like Bas Rutten and Frank Shamrock started having success in the UFC, it meant the wrestlers had to adapt or be left behind. And at the turn of the millennia, a new breed of wrestlers were taking note, and they were going to revolutionize the MMA world yet again. It was old news that wrestling defense was an essential part of any successful MMA fighter by 2000, but the next question was, what was the next iteration of the sport going to look like? And there was one clear answer. It was the sprawl and brawl era. Throughout the 2000s, the most consistent style of elite fighters were dangerous strikers with solid wrestling backgrounds. You only have to look at the marquee division in the sport at this time, light heavyweight, to see the evidence. From Vitor Belfort, Chuck Liddell, Rampage Jackson to Rashad Evans, they're all dangerous strikers with one-shot knockout power who relied on a wrestling base to keep the fight standing.
Watching the evolution, because it was almost like guys came in with one skill, and they were battling to see which skill would dominate. And then you had the mixture, the guys that would come in now with two skills,
like Marco Huas.
Yeah. And then you have guys like Rashad who come in with like 2-3 skills, who could wrestle, who could box,
and can knock you out.
And it's like, wow. And then you got guys like Chuck, but Chuck just wanted to stand, but he had the wrestling to stop you from taking him down.
It was all about aggression, power, and ultimately removing your opponent from consciousness. Those older guys who were pure wrestlers couldn't keep up with this new level of striking. Ken Shamrock, Mark Coleman, and so many others suffered rapid declines once they were put in there with the new breed. And while the UFC was more than proof that MMA was changing, an organization across the globe was the ultimate epitome: Pride FC.
People always put Pride up on the pedestal, saying that's number one, and the UFC was two, because those 10-minute rounds, those are fucking gangster rounds. A lot of shit happens in 10 minutes. Like 10-5-5, that's a long fight for championship.
Yeah, that was a long time, and it was harder for wrestlers to fight in Pride, because if you didn't take your shot right and you got down, you was expecting knees on top of your head.
Most of their top stars, Wanderlei Silva, Mirko Cro Cop, Shogun Rua, and Dan Henderson, all fought very similarly. Defend takedowns at all costs and let your striking do the talking. And unless your name was Anderson Silva, Fedor, or GSP, fighters so ahead of their time that the rules didn't apply to them, the sprawl and brawl style was the go-to for most. For old school fans of MMA, this was their golden period of the sport. There were dozens of stars, different organizations putting on great events, and truly exciting fights. The sport was in that period of still being raw and new, but was also developing into something much larger at the same time. With the sport evolving yet again, so did the fighters. And now it was these striking wrestler hybrids under threat of being dethroned for good. At the turn of the decade, two guys were running rampant in their respective divisions: Demetrius Johnson and John Jones. They had skill sets that we'd never seen before in MMA.
John didn't lose any rounds. John was smashing people. You look what he did to Rashad Evans. You look what he did to Rampage Jackson. You look what he did to Lyoto Machida. Look what he did to everybody. Everybody he fought.
John Jones had everything, and he destroyed the entire previous generation at light heavyweight. Unlike the people that came before him, Jones had multiple routes to victory, better game plans, and the ability to change his style to exploit his opponent's weakness. And this jack-of-all-trades type of fighter swept through the sport. At the time, the elite fighters were guys like Jose Aldo, Dominic Cruz, Frankie Edgar, and GSP.
How beautiful was that armbar that Demetrius Johnson
Crazy.
did? Shit, man, it slammed to it.
Slammed to the armbar in the air, and he told me he
practice it now.
that.
I practice it now. I've been training.
Do you?
Yeah,
practice
I learned from these guys, man. I learned from a lot of these guys.
Yeah.
TJ Dillashaw, he switch, man, every time. He's changed angle. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Dominic Cruz, man, his footwork, man, it's insane.
While many of them had a style they'd favor, the most successful ones could outstrike the grapplers and outgrapple the strikers. And as the decade progressed, the era of the true martial artist only grew. All of a sudden, fighters like Robert Whittaker, Max Holloway, Stipe Miocic, and Tyron Woodley were the ones to beat. It was a time where a lot of the top stars coming through were the first group to practice MMA from the very beginning.
You got to go to like UFC 12. You see Vitor's debut, and you go, okay, well now we're looking at like what a real modern mixed martial artist looks like. Yeah. And then there's a few guys along the way that were outliers that were much better than everybody else. And now you have a whole roster filled with people like that.
The days of the entire UFC roster being made up of athletes who had moved across from other sports were gone. But like every generation, there are outliers. Fighters so skilled that they're above the norm. Khabib and his wrestling, Conor McGregor and his pinpoint striking, Ronda Rousey's armbars, and Joanna's Muay Thai. Yet for the majority, being 7 out of 10 in every discipline is the way to go. You had no weakness that could be targeted, and more often than not, there would be one aspect of fighting where you would have a clear advantage. And for most fans, they probably would have assumed this would be the way of MMA forever. After all, the UFC had been around for numerous decades, so we surely would have figured out the sport by now, right? Well, for the most part, yes, because even today, the all-round martial artists are extremely successful. But recently, MMA has gone full circle, and a style that has once come and gone looks like it's back to take over once again. In the last couple of years, the all-out wrestler has returned. We have the invasion of Dagestani grapplers, then recent champions like Aljamain Sterling, Merab Dvalishvili, Belal Muhammad, to name a few.
When I was about to start fighting, and when I started fighting, I said, man, when these Russian dudes from these regions start to come, it's going to be a problem. Because you know how good they were as wrestlers, right? What's going to happen when these guys come into fighting?
Right, learn striking.
And it's the same thing.
And it feels like a bit of a throwback. Leon Edwards knew Belal was going to try and wrestle, the same with Sugar Sean and Merab, yet they couldn't do a thing to nullify the takedown. So long as their stand-up game is good enough to survive, they'll just hunt takedown after takedown for 25 straight minutes. It's led some fans to critique the modern age of the UFC and call it boring, but we still have a huge variety of fighters at this present time. But you can't deny, these cardio-heavy pressure fighters are having success. Even in divisions with unique champions like Alex Pereira and Zhang Weili, fans are desperate to see how they get on against the likes of Tatiana Suarez and Ankalaev, who will likely bring the wrestling to them. And as the sport continues to develop, we can only wait and see what style will reign supreme next.